The Britannic, sister ship to the ill-fated Titanic, was heralded as the safest ocean liner of her time. Designed with advanced safety features to avoid the tragic fate of her predecessor, she seemed invincible. Yet, on November 21, 1916, while serving as a hospital ship in World War I, the Britannic sank in the Aegean Sea in just 55 minutes, faster than the Titanic. Although a German mine triggered the disaster, it wasn't the explosion that sealed her fate. 60 years after it capsized, famous ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau discovered the ship, and subsequently, the real truth behind the Britannic's sinking was revealed. 7 a.m. and 6 seconds. A serene morning. The day began with promise. The Britannic, gleaming white with prominent red crosses, was cruising peacefully through the calm waters of the Aegean Sea. On board were a mix of crew, nurses, and medical staff preparing for their next mission to transport wounded soldiers. The atmosphere was relaxed. Passengers strolled the decks, while others below prepared breakfast or tended to routine tasks. To ventilate the lower wards, many portholes were opened, a seemingly minor decision that would later have catastrophic consequences. Despite being in a war zone, there was little sense of danger. The Britannic's hospital ship status theoretically offered her protection under the Hague Conventions. Yet, beneath the placid waves lay a deadly threat. German naval mines, placed indiscriminately to disrupt Allied shipping routes. 8:12 a.m. and 29 seconds. The explosion. Out of nowhere, a powerful explosion rocked the ship, sending shockwaves through the hull. The blast came from the starboard bow, where the Britannic struck a German mine. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the ship's steel frame and sending a plume of water, oil, and debris skyward. The mine's detonation caused catastrophic damage. It tore open the ship's hull, flooding the forward compartments within seconds. Key structural areas, including the fireman's tunnel, were compromised. The fireman's tunnel, a passageway connecting the boiler rooms, now acted as a conduit for seawater, allowing it to bypass watertight bulkheads. This critical failure nullified the ship's defenses against sinking. Coal bunkers in the affected areas were obliterated, scattering coal and creating clouds of hazardous dust. The steam pipes in the boiler rooms ruptured under the force of the blast, releasing scalding steam and injuring crew members desperately trying to assess the damage. The explosion also destroyed the ship's telephone communication system, cutting off vital lines between key areas. Panic set in as crew members, now isolated, scrambled to contain the chaos. Yet, despite the severity of the blast, the Britannic's advanced design should have prevented her from sinking. 8:14 a.m. and 48 seconds. The preventable flood. The Britannic was equipped with safety measures designed to withstand extensive damage. Her double hull and watertight bulkheads were engineered to keep her afloat, even if multiple compartments flooded. But these features relied on the assumption that no additional water would enter. Unfortunately, earlier that morning, many portholes in the lower decks had been opened to ventilate the ship's interior. This routine action, while seemingly harmless, became a fatal mistake as the bow dipped lower into the sea. As the open portholes sank below the waterline, seawater poured into the ship at an uncontrollable rate. What should have been a contained flooding event rapidly spread, inundating compartments that should have remained dry. The impact of the flooding was immediate and catastrophic. Water surged into medical wards, storage rooms, and even areas designed to stay sealed in emergencies. The pumps, though powerful, were not designed to handle this volume of water. Within minutes, the ship's carefully designed safety features were rendered useless. Adding to the crisis was the ship's forward motion. Captain Bartlett had ordered the engines restarted to beach the ship on Key Island, but this action exacerbated the flooding. As the Britannic moved forward, the force of the water against the damaged bow increased, accelerating the inflow through the open portholes and torn hull. Had the portholes remained closed, experts believe the Britannic could have stayed afloat long enough for a controlled evacuation, or even to reach the shallow waters of Key Island. Instead, This oversight doomed the ship to an inevitable and rapid descent. 8:17 a.m. and 26 seconds. Desperate measures. Captain Charles Bartlett, nicknamed Iceberg Charlie for his cautious nature, acted swiftly. Realizing the extent of the damage, he ordered the ship to head full speed toward the nearby Kia Island, hoping to beach her and save lives. The engines roared to life, and for a moment, it seemed the plan might work. But as the water continued to pour in, the rising levels reached the engine rooms, short-circuiting electrical systems and halting the engines. The Britannic slowed to a crawl and eventually stopped entirely, leaving her vulnerable to the sea's relentless grip. 8:20 a.m. and 19 seconds. Chaos and panic spread. As the situation deteriorated, panic spread. Some passengers and crew began lowering lifeboats before the captain officially ordered an evacuation. On the starboard side, this decision proved deadly. 8:21 a.m. and 41 seconds. Lifeboats launched prematurely were pulled toward the still-spinning propellers. The massive blades, designed to push the ship forward, now became instruments of destruction. At least one lifeboat was sucked into the propellers, its occupants crushed and shredded. Survivors on other lifeboats could only watch in horror as debris and bodies were flung into the air. Despite the tragedy, some lifeboats on the port side managed to launch safely. These survivors paddled furiously to distance themselves from the sinking ship, even as cries for help echoed across the water. 8:30 a.m. and 15 seconds. Violet Jessup plunges into the ocean. Among the passengers was Violet Jessup, a nurse who had survived the Titanic sinking just 4 years earlier. Finding herself in peril once again, Jessup leaped from her lifeboat into the sea to avoid being pulled into the propellers. The cold sea enveloped her as she plunged beneath the surface. Violet fought her way to the surface, gasping for air, only to be confronted with a sight she would never forget. Amid the gruesome chaos, Violet's eyes were drawn to a horrifying scene nearby. The mangled remains of an orderly she had worked with aboard the ship. His body was unrecognizable, torn apart by the relentless blades of the starboard propeller. She later recalled in vivid detail how his skull had been violently cracked open, exposing his brain. A sight so visceral and disturbing, it momentarily froze her in shock. The crimson-stained water around her bore silent testimony to the destruction wrought by the ship's machinery. Violet struggled to focus, pushing the horror from her mind as she clung to debris and swam away from the ship's deadly stern. 9:06 a.m. and 8 seconds, the beginning of the end. By this time, the bow of the Britannic was fully submerged, plunging into the depths of the Aegean Sea. The once pristine hospital ship was now a chaotic spectacle of destruction. The stern began to lift dramatically out of the water, tilting at an ever steeper angle. Survivors described the sight as both awe-inspiring and terrifying. A massive ship, nearly 900 feet long, seeming to defy gravity as it balanced precariously. For those still on board, the angle of the deck became a death trap. Clinging to railings or scrambling across the tilting surface, many lost their grip and tumbled into the sea. Heavy equipment, furniture, and debris cascaded down the decks, crushing anyone in their path. Steam whistles blared one final mournful cry, cutting through the sounds of bending metal and rushing water. 9:07 a.m. and 38 seconds. The stress on the ship's internal framework reached a breaking point. The forward funnel, already weakened by the force of the sinking, broke loose and collapsed. As it plummeted into the water, it sent waves of debris flying in every direction. Tragically, several survivors in lifeboats near the bow were struck by falling pieces of the funnel, their vessels overturned by the impact. Others, swimming nearby, were either dragged under by the suction or fatally struck by the wreckage. The aft portion of the ship rose higher, exposing the massive propellers that had caused so much devastation earlier. The propellers, now motionless, gleamed menacingly in the sunlight, a haunting reminder of their deadly role in the tragedy. 9:07 a.m. and 13 seconds. As the ship's internal compartments filled completely, the stern began its descent. Witnesses in lifeboats described the sound as a symphony of destruction, steel groaning, rivets snapping, and air rushing out of the doomed vessel. The ship's vast weight, combined with the force of gravity, pulled her down swiftly. 9:08 a.m. and 53 seconds. With water rushing into every corner, the Britannic took her final plunge. Survivors noted the immense whirlpool created by her descent, a swirling vortex of water, debris, and oil. Those too close were sucked into the current, struggling desperately to stay afloat as the ship vanished beneath the waves. The moment the Britannic disappeared, an eerie silence followed. The ocean, which had moments before been filled with chaos, now seemed unnaturally calm. Survivors clung to debris, lifeboats, and each other, dazed and traumatized by the rapid sequence of events. 9:09 a.m. and 30 seconds. A thick oil slick spread across the water, further complicating rescue efforts. The slick clung to survivors, burning their skin and making breathing difficult. The few lifeboats that remained upright paddled furiously to avoid the whirlpool, their occupants scanning the water for others who might still be alive. For those who had escaped, the realization began to set in. The Britannic, one of the largest and most advanced ships ever built, was gone. Her sinking, faster and deadlier than the Titanic, defied the belief that she was unsinkable. Ultimately, 60 years after the ship was discovered, it was found that a deadly mix of human error, design flaws, and the chaos of wartime were the primary factors that contributed to one of history's most preventable maritime tragedies.